The world only remembers a man when something finally breaks inside him. Daniel Mercer whispered to himself as the freezing Arizona wind pushed dust across the empty truck stop parking lot outside Flagstaff. And at 63 years old, with a faded denim jacket hanging loosely over his tired frame and only $11 left in his wallet, he realized nobody had said his name with warmth in nearly 3 years. The old pickup beside him rattled every time the wind hit it, sounding like it might fall apart before sunrise, and Daniel stood there staring at the gray horizon while truck engines growled in the distance like restless animals wandering through the cold desert morning. He had once owned a small construction company in Phoenix, once had a wife who laughed loudly in grocery stores and a daughter who used to run into his arms after school, but life had slowly taken things away from him, one unpaid bill, one argument, and one lonely silence at a time, until all he had left was a rusted truck, a coffee-stained duffel bag, and memories that hurt more every year. He pulled his hands deeper into his jacket pockets as the smell of gasoline and wet asphalt drifted through the air, and that was when he noticed the German Shepherd sitting beside the edge of the highway, completely still, like it had been waiting for someone who never came back. The dog looked large but exhausted, its black and tan fur dirty from dust and rain, its ribs barely visible beneath the thick coat, and its amber eyes fixed on every passing car with heartbreaking patience. Daniel watched for nearly a minute before quietly muttering, "Buddy, nobody's coming for you." The dog turned its head slowly toward him, ears twitching against the wind, and in that strange, silent moment something about the animal felt painfully familiar. Not dangerous, not wild, just abandoned. Daniel looked away at first because he already knew what loneliness looked like, and he was tired of recognizing it everywhere he went. He walked toward the gas station entrance, bought the cheapest black coffee he could afford, then stood under the flickering neon lights trying not to think about how cold the night ahead was going to become. But when he glanced back through the window, the German Shepherd was still there by the roadside, unmoving beneath the dark clouds rolling over the mountains. 20 minutes later, Daniel climbed into his truck and turned the key twice before the engine finally coughed alive. And just as he pulled toward the exit, he saw the dog begin walking slowly along the shoulder of the highway with its head lowered against the wind. Something tightened painfully in his chest. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe memory. Maybe the simple, unbearable feeling of seeing another living thing trying to survive one more day alone. Daniel exhaled hard, slammed the brakes, and stared through the cracked windshield for several long seconds before opening the passenger door toward the empty road. "You coming or not?" he called out roughly, pretending his voice carried less emotion than it did. The German Shepherd froze, uncertain at first, then cautiously walked toward the truck through the cold morning air while 18-wheelers thundered past behind him. And for the first time in longer than Daniel Mercer wanted to admit, the silence around him no longer felt completely empty. The German Shepherd climbed carefully into the passenger seat, as if it had spent its whole life learning how not to bother people, and Daniel noticed immediately how quietly the animal moved despite its size. The dog circled once on the torn fabric seat before settling down with tired eyes fixed on the windshield while cold rain began tapping softly against the truck roof. Daniel pulled back onto Interstate 40 without saying much, but every few minutes he glanced sideways at the animal like he still could not believe it was there. "You probably smell worse than I do," he muttered dryly, and for the first time in weeks a faint smile appeared across his weathered face. The dog did not react except for a slow wag of its tail against the seat. The heater barely worked, pushing out weak bursts of lukewarm air that smelled faintly like dust and old engine oil, but the small cab somehow felt warmer than it had the night before. Daniel drove west for nearly an hour beneath heavy clouds hanging low over the Arizona mountains while classic country music crackled softly through broken speakers. Every once in a while the German Shepherd lifted its head whenever another truck passed beside them, almost like it was searching for someone familiar among strangers speeding through the storm. Daniel understood that feeling better than he wanted to admit. Around noon, he pulled into a quiet rest stop outside Williams where faded vending machines hummed beside empty picnic tables soaked from rain. He stepped out, stretched his stiff back, then opened the passenger door carefully. "Come on, buddy," he said. The dog jumped down slowly, paws splashing through shallow puddles across the cracked pavement. Inside the convenience store, Daniel bought the cheapest hot dogs available along with a large cup of water, ignoring the judgmental glance from the teenage cashier when he asked for extra napkins. Back outside, he tore one hot dog in half and crouched beside the truck. "You eat first," he said quietly. The German shepherd hesitated for only a second before eating carefully from Daniel's hand, without aggression or fear. That was what surprised him most. A starving dog usually guarded food like treasure, but this one acted gentle, almost trained. Daniel studied the worn leather collar hidden beneath wet fur and finally noticed a small rusted tag hanging from it. He turned it over with cold fingers, expecting to find a phone number or address. But the engraving had been scratched almost completely away except for a single word barely visible near the bottom. Ranger. Daniel stared at the name for several seconds while wind swept rainwater across the parking lot. "Ranger," he repeated softly, testing how it sounded aloud. The dog looked up immediately, ears alert for the first time all morning. Daniel felt something twist unexpectedly inside his chest. Somebody had loved this animal once. Somebody had spoken that name with affection. He leaned back against the truck and looked out across the endless gray highway disappearing into the distance. "Yeah," he whispered after a long silence. "I know what it feels like when people stop looking for you." Ranger slowly walked closer until his large body rested against Daniel's leg beneath the cold Arizona rain, and neither of them moved away. By late afternoon, the storm had grown heavier across northern Arizona, turning the highway into long ribbons of blurred headlights and wet pavement, and Daniel kept both hands tight on the steering wheel, while Ranger rested quietly beside him with his head lowered near the edge of the seat. Every now and then the dog would glance toward Daniel as if making sure he was still there, and strangely enough Daniel found himself doing the same thing. It had been years since another living creature depended on him for anything. Somewhere near Ash Fork, the truck engine made a rough grinding sound that immediately tightened Daniel's stomach. "Do not do this to me now," he muttered under his breath while tapping the dashboard with frustration. The old pickup jerked once before losing speed fast enough that passing drivers began moving around them, with irritated honks echoing through the rain. Daniel guided the truck onto the narrow shoulder and shut the engine off completely. Silence filled the cab except for rain striking the windshield and the distant roar of highway traffic. Daniel leaned back with exhausted eyes closed for several seconds before laughing bitterly to himself. "Figures," he whispered. "One more thing falling apart." Ranger slowly lifted his head and pressed his nose gently against Daniel's arm. It was such a simple movement, but after months of isolation it nearly broke something open inside him. Daniel swallowed hard and opened the truck door before the emotion could settle too deeply. Cold rain soaked through his jacket almost instantly as he lifted the hood and stared at the smoking engine with the helpless expression of a man who already knew he could not afford repairs. Cars continued flying past without slowing down. Nobody looked twice at the older man stranded beside the interstate in bad weather. Daniel wiped rainwater from his face and stepped back with a defeated sigh. "We might be sleeping here tonight, Ranger." The German shepherd remained inside the cab, watching him carefully through the passenger window. Nearly 20 minutes passed before an old dark green towing truck finally pulled onto the shoulder ahead of them. A heavy-set man wearing a brown work jacket stepped out and waved. "You all right over there?" he shouted through the rain. Daniel hesitated before nodding once. The man introduced himself as Earl Thompson, owner of a small repair garage about 10 miles west, and after checking the engine for only a minute, he shook his head slowly. "Water pump is gone," he explained. "You are lucky the whole thing did not overheat worse." Daniel stared at the wet pavement, already calculating the money he did not have. Earl noticed immediately. "Tell you what," he said after a moment. "I can tow you into town tonight. We will figure the rest out tomorrow." Daniel opened his mouth to refuse out of habit, but before he could speak, Ranger suddenly jumped down from the passenger seat and walked directly toward Earl with cautious curiosity. The older mechanic smiled immediately. "Well now," he laughed softly while scratching behind the dog's ears. "Looks like your partner trusts me already." Daniel stood frozen for a second, watching the scene beneath the cold rain and dim highway lights. He could not remember the last time kindness had arrived without asking for something in return, and for reasons he could not fully explain, that frightened him almost as much as being alone. The small-town garage sat beneath flickering yellow lights at the edge of Williams like something forgotten by time. With faded signs hanging crooked above two repair bays, and old pickup trucks lined along a chain-link fence darkened by rain. Earl parked the tow truck beside the building, while Daniel climbed down slowly with stiff knees and exhaustion buried deep in his face. Ranger jumped out beside him immediately, staying close enough that his shoulder brushed against Daniel's leg as thunder rolled softly across the mountains in the distance. "Office is still warm," Earl said while unlocking the side door. "You both can stay there tonight if you want. Storm is supposed to get worse." Daniel instinctively started to refuse again because pride had become the only thing he still owned, but the freezing wind cut through his soaked jacket, hard enough to silence him. Inside, the garage smelled like motor oil, coffee, and old wood heated by a struggling furnace somewhere in the back. The office itself was small but clean, with a worn brown couch, a coffee machine older than Daniel's truck, and family photographs covering nearly every wall. Ranger walked slowly around the room, sniffing everything carefully before lying down beside the couch, as if he already understood they were safe there for the night. Earl handed Daniel a dry towel and pointed toward a small storage room. "There are extra blankets in there," he said. "My wife always says I keep too many." Daniel nodded quietly. "I appreciate this." Earl gave a tired shrug, like helping stranded people was nothing unusual. "This highway leaves a lot of folks needing help." For a while neither man spoke much. Rain hammered against the garage roof while Earl worked at a cluttered desk sorting invoices under the glow of a small lamp. Daniel sat on the couch sipping burnt coffee from a foam cup, watching Ranger sleep peacefully beside him with one paw stretched across the floor. It amazed him how quickly the dog trusted him. Or maybe, Daniel thought quietly to himself, lonely creatures simply recognize each other faster. His eyes drifted toward the family photos hanging on the wall. Earl standing beside a smiling woman near the Grand Canyon. Two younger men holding fish at a lake somewhere in Colorado. Christmas pictures. Birthday cakes. Ordinary moments frozen in frames. Daniel felt a familiar ache settle heavily in his chest. "You got kids?" Earl asked suddenly without looking up from his paperwork. Daniel hesitated before answering. "A daughter." Earl nodded. "You close?" The silence that followed felt longer than the storm outside. Daniel stared down into his untouched coffee. "Not anymore." Earl did not press further. Maybe he recognized the kind of pain that only grows worse when strangers ask questions. A little later, Daniel noticed Ranger suddenly lift his head toward the office window with alert ears. Headlights swept slowly across the rain outside before stopping near the garage entrance. A silver SUV sat idling for several seconds, its driver barely visible through the storm-dark glass. Earl frowned slightly and stood up. "That is strange," he muttered. The vehicle remained there another moment before finally pulling away back toward the highway without anyone stepping out. Daniel watched the taillights disappear into the rain while an uneasy feeling settled in his stomach. Beside him, Ranger had already stood up completely now, staring toward the dark parking lot with focused attention and low, quiet breathing that no longer seemed relaxed. Daniel slowly placed a hand against the dog's neck and realized for the first time since finding him beside the interstate that maybe Ranger had not simply been abandoned after all. Daniel barely slept that night. The storm continued rattling the garage windows until after midnight, while the old furnace clicked on and off with uneven groans that echoed through the small office. Ranger stayed awake longer than usual too, lifting his head every time headlights passed somewhere beyond the highway. Around 3 in the morning, Daniel finally sat upright on the couch and rubbed both hands across his tired face while staring into the darkness. Years ago, he used to wake up beside his wife Rebecca during storms like this. She would complain about thunder shaking the house in Phoenix, while their daughter Emily laughed from her bedroom because she loved bad weather. Daniel could still remember those sounds perfectly even after all this time, and somehow that made the silence now feel even heavier. Ranger slowly stood and walked over before resting his head against Daniel's knee. "You got ghosts too, huh?" Daniel whispered quietly. The dog's ears twitched at the sound of his voice. Morning arrived gray and cold beneath low clouds hanging over Williams. Earl was already working beneath the hood of the truck when Daniel stepped outside carrying a cup of coffee. Ranger followed closely beside him across the wet pavement. "Bad news and less bad news," Earl called out while wiping grease from his hands. "Truck can be fixed, but it is going to take a couple days waiting on parts." Daniel stared down at the ground immediately. I do not have enough money for a motel. Earl nodded, like he expected that answer. You can help around here until the repairs are done. I could use another pair of hands. Daniel looked surprised. You serious? You know engines? Earl asked. Daniel gave a faint, tired smile for the first time in days. I spent 30 years rebuilding half the construction equipment in Arizona. Earl laughed loudly, then stopped standing around and grabbed that toolbox. For the next several hours, Daniel worked beside Earl inside the garage, while rain dripped steadily outside and classic rock played softly through an old radio mounted near the shelves. Ranger stayed nearby the entire time, quietly observing customers coming and going through the repair base. Something about the dog continued bothering Daniel, though. Ranger reacted differently whenever silver vehicles passed near the shop entrance. His body stiffened slightly, ears raised, eyes fixed with unusual focus until the vehicles disappeared again. Near lunchtime, a young waitress from the diner across the street walked into the garage, carrying paper bags full of burgers and fries. Earl, you forgot your order again, she said with a laugh before noticing Daniel. You must be the stranded traveler. Daniel nodded politely while wiping grease from his hands. The waitress crouched immediately to pet Ranger, but the German shepherd unexpectedly stepped backward instead of leaning into the attention. Not fearful, careful, like he had been taught not to trust strangers too quickly. Beautiful dog, she said softly. Looks trained. Earl glanced over from beneath the truck lift. That is exactly what I was thinking. Daniel looked toward Ranger again, while uneasy thoughts returned to him. This was not the behavior of a random abandoned animal. Everything about Ranger suggested discipline, intelligence, and familiarity with commands nobody had even tested yet. Later that afternoon, Daniel carried scrap metal toward the back lot, when Ranger suddenly stopped walking and stared toward the highway with intense focus. A silver SUV rolled slowly past the garage entrance again before disappearing around the corner toward town. Daniel froze instantly. Same color, same shape, same uneasy feeling in his chest. Beside him, Ranger let out a low, restless breath, while his eyes remained locked on the distant road long after the vehicle vanished from sight. That evening, the rain finally stopped over Williams, leaving the town wrapped in cold mountain fog and quiet streets shining beneath pale streetlights. Earl closed the garage early and invited Daniel to dinner at the small diner across the road, where locals gathered every night after work. Daniel almost refused out of habit again, but hunger and exhaustion finally outweighed his pride. Ranger followed beside them through the chilly air, drawing attention from nearly everyone they passed. Inside the diner, the smell of fresh coffee, grilled onions, and baked pie filled the warm, crowded room, while country music drifted softly from an old jukebox near the entrance. A few truck drivers sat along the counter watching a football game on television, while waitresses moved quickly between tables carrying steaming plates beneath fluorescent lights. Daniel slid awkwardly into a booth beside the window, while Ranger settled calmly near his feet. Your dog is better behaved than most people in this town, Earl joked while opening a menu. Daniel looked down at Ranger for a second before quietly answering, He is not really mine. Earl studied him carefully across the table. Maybe not officially. The comment stayed in Daniel's head longer than he expected. Halfway through dinner, the diner door opened, and the room suddenly grew quieter for a moment as a man in a dark gray jacket stepped inside. He looked to be in his late 40s with sharp features, neatly combed hair, and the kind of posture that immediately suggested authority. Ranger reacted instantly beneath the table. The German shepherd lifted his head sharply, body tense, eyes locked on the newcomer with complete focus. Daniel felt it immediately through the leash wrapped loosely around his wrist. The man noticed the dog almost at once. His expression changed for only half a second before returning to calm politeness, but Daniel caught it. Surprise. Recognition. Something deeper hidden beneath control. The stranger approached the counter and ordered coffee to go, while glancing subtly toward their booth more than once. Earl leaned closer across the table. That is Victor Hale, he whispered quietly. Owns security property outside town. Keeps mostly to himself. Daniel nodded slowly while continuing to watch Ranger. The dog never looked away from Hale for a second. Not aggression. Attention. Familiarity. As Victor Hale turned toward the exit, his eyes briefly met Daniel's. Beautiful shepherd, he said casually. Daniel forced a small nod. Found him near Flagstaff. Hale paused near the door, just long enough to study the dog again before replying. Animals like that usually belong somewhere. Then he walked out into the cold night without another word. The silence at the table afterward felt unusually heavy. Ranger remained alert even after the man disappeared outside. Earl frowned slightly. That was strange. Daniel stared toward the diner windows where the silver SUV sat parked beneath the streetlight outside. Same vehicle. Same feeling in his gut. Yeah, Daniel answered quietly. It was. Later that night back at the garage, Daniel could not sleep again. He sat alone outside beneath the weak yellow lights with an old blanket around his shoulders while Ranger rested beside him watching the empty highway. Fog drifted slowly across the road, and somewhere far off a train horn echoed through the mountains. Daniel rubbed a tired hand across his face before finally speaking aloud to the dog. Who are you really, huh? Ranger looked up at him calmly, amber eyes reflecting the pale garage lights with almost human understanding. Then suddenly the dog stood upright, ears raised sharply toward the darkness beyond the parking lot. Daniel turned immediately and spotted a distant figure standing near the fence across the road, partially hidden by fog. The person remained motionless for several seconds before quietly disappearing back into the night. Daniel stood slowly from the folding chair outside the garage while the cold night air drifted through the parking lot carrying the scent of wet asphalt and pine trees from the mountains beyond town. Ranger remained perfectly still beside him with his eyes locked toward the darkness, where the figure had disappeared seconds earlier. For a moment Daniel considered walking across the road to investigate, but something deep in his instincts told him not to. The figure had not moved like a drunk wanderer or some harmless local passing through town. Whoever it was had been watching quietly, deliberately. Daniel placed a hand against Ranger's back and felt the muscles beneath the thick fur still tense with alertness. Come on, he said softly. We are done with mysteries tonight. Back inside the office, the warmth of the old furnace barely pushed away the cold clinging to Daniel's clothes. He locked the garage door carefully before sitting down on the couch, while Ranger circled once near the entrance instead of settling beside him like usual. The dog stayed awake for nearly another hour listening to sounds outside that Daniel could not hear. Eventually, exhaustion pulled Daniel into shallow, restless sleep, filled with old memories he wished would stay buried. He dreamed about Emily again. She was 16 in the dream, sitting in the passenger seat of his old work truck eating fries while laughing at one of his terrible jokes during a drive home from school. Daniel could remember the exact shade of sunset through the windshield and the sound of her voice so clearly that waking up hurt more than the dream itself. Morning sunlight cut through the office blinds when Earl knocked gently on the door, holding 2 coffees. You look awful, he said with a grin. Daniel rubbed his face tiredly. That makes 2 of us. Ranger immediately moved toward the window again before Daniel even stood up, watching the highway outside with focused attention. Earl noticed it too. That dog acts like he is guarding something. Daniel stared quietly at Ranger for a second. Or someone. The garage stayed busy through most of the morning with travelers stopping for repairs and locals bringing in trucks damaged by the storm. Daniel lost himself in the rhythm of work for a while, grateful for anything that kept his mind occupied. Around noon, Earl handed him the keys to an old blue pickup parked behind the shop. Parts supplier called, Earl explained. Need someone to grab a shipment from Prescott this afternoon. Daniel hesitated. You trust me with your truck already? Earl shrugged casually. Ranger likes you. That seems good enough for me. The comment landed deeper than Earl probably intended. Daniel had spent years believing nobody trusted him anymore, including himself. An hour later, Daniel and Ranger were driving south, through winding mountain roads beneath clear skies, finally breaking after days of rain. Sunlight stretched across the pine forest while country music played softly through the radio. And for the first time since losing everything, Daniel almost felt normal again. Then Ranger suddenly lifted his head sharply and stared into the side mirror. Daniel glanced up instinctively and felt his stomach tighten immediately. Far behind them, a silver SUV appeared around the curve in the highway, maintaining distance but never falling away. Daniel watched it silently for nearly 2 miles before gripping the steering wheel harder. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe paranoia. But deep down he already knew it was neither. Ranger continued staring through the rear window without blinking once. And when Daniel finally whispered, "They are following us," The German shepherd let out a low, uneasy breath like he understood every word. Daniel kept his eyes on the rearview mirror while the blue pickup rolled through the mountain highway south of Williams, sunlight flashing between tall pine trees as curves twisted along the ridgeline. The silver SUV stayed far enough back to appear casual, but every time Daniel slowed slightly, it slowed too. Every time he changed lanes, the SUV followed without hesitation. Ranger remained standing upright on the passenger seat, with focused eyes fixed behind them, ears sharp and body tense in a way Daniel had never seen before. "All right," Daniel muttered quietly while gripping the steering wheel tighter. "Now I know I am not imagining things." He took the next exit suddenly toward a small gas station tucked beside the highway near a campground entrance. Gravel crunched beneath the tires as Daniel pulled beside an old pump station surrounded by faded signs and dusty picnic tables. He stepped out casually, while pretending to stretch his back, but his eyes immediately searched the road behind them. 10 seconds later, the silver SUV passed the station slowly without turning in. Daniel caught a quick glimpse of the driver through the windshield. Victor Hale. No question now. Ranger let out a low, restless breath from inside the truck while watching the vehicle disappear around the bend. Daniel stood motionless for a moment beneath the afternoon sun, trying to understand why a man like Hale would care about one stray German shepherd found beside a highway. None of it made sense anymore. Inside the station, Daniel bought coffee and stared absent-mindedly at a rack of tourist postcards while his thoughts raced. Near the register, a small local newspaper sat folded beside the cash register with a headline mentioning a private security company expanding operations outside town. The accompanying photo showed Victor Hale shaking hands with county officials beside a fenced training property near the mountains. Daniel studied the image closely and immediately noticed something that made his pulse quicken. Standing beside Hale in the photograph was a German shepherd nearly identical to Ranger. Same markings, same alert posture, same intelligent eyes. Daniel bought the paper without saying a word and returned outside quickly. Ranger sniffed the newspaper the second Daniel opened it across the truck hood, then stared directly at the photograph with sudden intense focus. "You know him," Daniel whispered quietly. Ranger touched the image gently with his nose before looking back toward the highway. A strange heaviness settled into Daniel's chest. This dog had not been lost accidentally. Somehow Ranger had escaped from whatever operation Hale was involved with, and now Hale wanted him back badly enough to follow strangers through northern Arizona. The realization should have convinced Daniel to hand the dog over immediately and walk away from the trouble, but instead he felt something entirely different growing inside him. Protective instinct. The same feeling he used to have when Emily was little and afraid during thunderstorms. Daniel folded the newspaper slowly and looked down at Ranger beside him. "I do not know what happened to you," he said softly, "but I do know fear when I see it." Ranger remained close against his leg, calm now that the SUV had disappeared. A few minutes later, Daniel climbed back into the truck and continued toward Prescott beneath bright afternoon skies stretching endlessly over the mountains. Yet the peaceful scenery no longer relaxed him. Every passing vehicle made him glance twice. Every curve in the road carried tension now. Nearly 40 miles later, his phone suddenly rang from the cup holder beside him. Daniel frowned because almost nobody ever called him anymore. He answered cautiously. Earl's voice came through strained and uneasy. "Daniel," he said quickly, "listen carefully. Victor Hale just came by the garage asking questions about you and the dog." Daniel felt ice spread through his chest. "What kind of questions?" Earl hesitated only briefly before answering. The kind that make a man wish he had never answered them at all. Daniel tightened his grip on the steering wheel while the highway stretched endlessly ahead through northern Arizona, golden afternoon sunlight washing over the mountains as Earl's uneasy words echoed in his mind. Ranger sat alert beside him now, no longer resting or relaxed, watching every passing vehicle with constant focus. "What exactly did Hale say?" Daniel asked quietly into the phone. Earl lowered his voice on the other end. "He claimed the dog belongs to his security company. Said the animal disappeared during transport after an accident outside Flagstaff." Daniel glanced at Ranger. "You believe him?" Earl hesitated. "I think that man is hiding something." The line stayed silent for a moment except for static and distant garage noises in the background. Then Earl spoke again carefully. "Daniel, I have lived in this town 30 years. Folks around here know Hale has money and influence, but nobody really knows what goes on out at that property of his. Daniel felt tension settle deeper in his chest. What kind of property? Private training facility, Earl answered. Guards, surveillance, fences. They keep mostly to themselves. Daniel looked out across the desert highway. While old instincts he thought had died years ago slowly returned. He had spent decades solving problems, protecting crews, managing chaos under pressure. Somewhere along the line grief had hollowed him out until he forgot who he used to be. But now something inside him was waking up again. I will head back soon, Daniel finally said. Just keep the garage locked tonight. After ending the call, he drove in silence for nearly 20 minutes before pulling onto a scenic overlook high above the valley. Wind swept across the cliffs carrying the scent of pine and dry earth, while distant mountains glowed orange beneath the lowering sun. Daniel stepped out slowly with Ranger following beside him. The overlook was empty except for an older couple taking photographs near the railing before eventually driving away. Once they were alone, Daniel leaned against the hood and unfolded the newspaper again. Ranger immediately focused on Victor Hale's photograph like before. You were not just some guard dog, were you? Daniel asked quietly. Ranger stared at the image for another second before suddenly stepping backward and turning toward the highway with alert ears. Daniel followed his gaze immediately. Far below on the winding road, he spotted the silver SUV parked partially hidden beneath a cluster of trees. Watching. Waiting. Daniel felt anger rise slowly inside him for the first time in years. Not panic. Not fear. Anger. Somebody had frightened this animal badly enough that even seeing the man's face changed his behavior completely. Daniel crouched beside Ranger and placed both hands gently against the thick fur around his neck. Listen to me, he whispered softly. Nobody is taking you anywhere tonight. Ranger held eye contact with him in a way that felt almost human. Complete trust. The kind Daniel no longer believed he deserved from anyone. As evening approached, they finally reached Prescott and loaded the repair parts into the truck behind a small warehouse near downtown. Daniel tried acting normal, but he noticed the silver SUV twice more during the drive back north. Always distant. Always careful. By the time darkness covered the mountains, Daniel knew this was no coincidence anymore. Near midnight, he finally returned to Williams and parked behind Earl's garage with headlights off. The shop looked dark and quiet beneath the cold stars. Too quiet. Ranger climbed down immediately and began pacing near the office entrance with visible unease. Daniel felt his stomach tighten. He walked carefully toward the side door and noticed fresh tire tracks pressed into the dirt behind the building. Large tires. Recent. Then he spotted something lying near the garage steps beneath the weak security light. Earl's coffee mug shattered across the pavement beside an overturned chair. Daniel moved quickly toward the garage entrance while gravel crunched beneath his boots and cold night air swept through the empty lot. Ranger stayed pressed close beside him, with every muscle tense beneath his thick coat. The shattered coffee mug near the steps glistened under the security light beside the overturned chair, and Daniel immediately noticed the office door hanging slightly open. Earl, he called out sharply while stepping inside. No answer came back except the low hum of the furnace and distant highway traffic outside. The office looked disturbed, but not destroyed. Papers scattered across the desk. One drawer left hanging open. A lamp knocked sideways onto the floor beside the couch, where Daniel had slept the previous nights. Ranger moved carefully through the room, sniffing intensely before stopping near the back hallway, leading toward the repair base. Daniel followed him with growing dread in his chest. Inside the garage itself, everything appeared strangely untouched at first glance. Toolboxes still lined the walls. Vehicles remained parked beneath the lifts. But Earl's jacket hung abandoned over a chair beside the workbench, and his cell phone rested cracked on the concrete floor nearby. Daniel picked it up slowly. The screen was dark, but still functional. 3 missed calls from an unknown number glowed faintly across the display. Ranger suddenly let out a low, uneasy sound and turned toward the rear exit of the garage. Daniel followed again, pushing open the metal door leading outside behind the building. The cold wind hit, immediately carrying the smell of pine trees and motor oil across the dark lot. Tire tracks cut deeply through the dirt toward the highway access road beyond the fence. Fresh tracks. Daniel stared at them silently while anger and fear twisted together inside him. Then he heard movement behind him. Relax, Earl's voice said tiredly from the shadows near the storage shed. Daniel spun around instantly. Earl stepped into the weak security light looking exhausted but unharmed, one hand pressed against his lower back as if stiff from strain. Daniel exhaled sharply. Jesus, Earl. Earl gave a weary shake of his head. 2 men came by about an hour ago, asking where you were. They were polite enough at first, but something about them felt wrong. Daniel glanced toward the tire tracks again. Victor Hale. Earl nodded slowly. One of them mentioned working security for him. Ranger stood beside Daniel, staring toward Earl with alert but calm eyes now that the mechanic had appeared. Earl looked down at the dog carefully. The second they saw him, their whole attitude changed. Daniel felt his jaw tighten. Did they threaten you? Not directly, Earl answered, but they made it very clear they expected cooperation. Silence settled heavily between them while distant truck headlights rolled along the interstate beyond town. Finally, Earl looked directly at Daniel. What exactly did this dog get mixed up in? Daniel shook his head slowly. I still do not know. Earl sighed and leaned against the shed wall. Well, whatever it is, Hale wants that animal badly. Ranger suddenly moved forward toward Earl and sniffed carefully at the mechanic's jacket before stepping back again. Earl frowned slightly. That is strange. What? Daniel asked. Earl looked down at his sleeve. One of those men reached into his SUV earlier and pulled out a blanket while they were searching around the garage. Ranger's attention sharpened immediately at the word blanket. Earl continued slowly. The second they unfolded it, this dog started barking like crazy from inside the office. Daniel's pulse quickened. What kind of blanket? Dark green, Earl answered. Military style, maybe. Ranger suddenly walked toward the rear fence again and stared into the darkness beyond the highway with intense focus. Daniel followed the direction of his gaze and noticed faint lights glowing far off among the trees on the mountain ridge outside town. A fenced property sat there barely visible beneath the moonlight. Earl stepped beside him quietly. That, he said softly, is Victor Hale's training facility. Daniel stood silently beside Earl behind the garage while cold mountain wind moved through the pine trees and distant lights flickered from Victor Hale's property high along the ridge outside town. Ranger remained completely focused on the facility, ears raised sharply, body tense with recognition that no longer needed explanation. Daniel crossed his arms slowly against the cold and stared toward the fenced compound glowing faintly beneath the moonlight. You ever been up there? He asked quietly. Earl shook his head immediately. Nobody local gets invited. The older mechanic glanced at Ranger again before lowering his voice. But I have heard stories. Daniel looked toward him. Earl hesitated for a second like he regretted speaking already. Folks say Hale trains protection dogs for private clients. Wealthy people. Security companies. Maybe government contracts too. Daniel frowned slightly. That does not explain this. No, Earl admitted. It does not. Silence settled again while highway noise echoed faintly below the mountain road. Daniel could feel exhaustion pulling at him after days of tension and sleepless nights, but underneath the exhaustion something stronger kept growing. Purpose. He had spent years drifting through life after losing contact with Emily and watching his marriage collapse beneath grief and distance. Every morning before meeting Ranger had felt empty and directionless. Now suddenly every instinct inside him told him one thing clearly. The dog was afraid of going back there, and Daniel could not ignore that. I want to see the place, he said finally. Earl stared at him like he had lost his mind. Tonight, Daniel nodded once. If Hale is sending people after us already, then waiting only gives him more time. Earl rubbed both hands across his face tiredly before, sighing deeply. You always this stubborn? Used to be worse. Earl let out a quiet laugh despite himself. An hour later they drove north through winding mountain roads beneath a sky crowded with stars, while Ranger sat upright in the back seat, watching every curve ahead. Earl drove slowly with headlights dimmed once they reached the Forest Service road leading toward Hale's property. Tall pines surrounded them on both sides, while gravel cracked softly beneath the tires. The deeper they climbed into the mountains, the quieter Ranger became. Not relaxed. Focused. Daniel noticed the dog staring toward certain turns before they even reached them, almost like he already knew the road by memory. Finally, Earl killed the engine near a ridge overlooking the valley below. Through gaps in the trees, they could now see the training facility clearly for the first time. Tall fences surrounded several large buildings lit by floodlights. Security vehicles sat parked near gated entrances, while figures moved occasionally between structures in dark uniforms. Daniel studied the property carefully. That is more than a dog training center. Earl nodded uneasily. Exactly. Rangers suddenly moved closer to the windshield, staring toward a smaller isolated building near the rear fence line. Daniel followed his gaze and noticed something different there. A row of outdoor kennels partially hidden from the main compound. Even from this distance, Ranger's breathing changed noticeably the second he saw them. Daniel looked at the dog carefully. You came from there, did you not? Ranger kept staring toward the kennels without moving. Then, unexpectedly, the German shepherd let out a soft, low sound unlike anything Daniel had heard from him before. Not fear exactly. Sadness. Earl shifted uncomfortably beside him. Daniel, he said quietly, maybe we should leave before someone notices us. But Daniel barely heard him anymore, because his eyes had locked onto another figure stepping out from the isolated building near the kennels. A young woman wearing a dark jacket paused beneath the floodlights while holding a clipboard against her chest. Even from this distance, Daniel could tell she looked exhausted. Then the woman suddenly stopped walking and turned directly toward the ridge where they were parked hidden among the trees. Ranger immediately stood upright against the dashboard, tail moving for the first time all night. The young woman remained motionless beneath the floodlights for several long seconds, staring toward the dark ridge where Daniel and Earl sat hidden among the trees. Ranger pressed closer against the windshield with his tail, moving slowly now, not with excitement, but recognition. Daniel narrowed his eyes carefully. He knows her, he whispered. Earl looked uneasy beside him. Then maybe she knows him too. Down below, the woman glanced over her shoulder toward the main compound before walking quietly toward the isolated kennel building again. Just before disappearing inside, she paused and looked once more toward the ridge. Then she lifted her hand slightly against her jacket in a motion so subtle Daniel almost missed it. A signal. Ranger immediately let out a soft breath and pawed lightly against the dashboard. Daniel felt his pulse quicken. She saw us. Earl gripped the steering wheel tighter. Which means we should probably leave. But Daniel kept watching the building below, while thoughts turned rapidly in his mind. Everything about Ranger's reaction had changed the moment the woman appeared. Trust. Familiarity. Hope. No, Daniel said quietly. I think she wants us to stay. For nearly 20 minutes they remained hidden among the trees, while the compound below settled into late-night routine. Security vehicles moved occasionally near the gates while floodlights illuminated long stretches of fencing across the property. Finally, the side door near the kennels opened again. The woman stepped outside alone, carrying what looked like a large canvas bag over one shoulder. She walked calmly toward the rear fence line, without drawing attention from the guards near the main buildings. Then she stopped beneath a dead pine tree near the edge of the property and waited. Ranger whined softly now, unable to stay still any longer. Daniel exchanged one look with Earl before opening the truck door carefully. Cold mountain air rushed around them as they moved quietly through the trees toward the lower slope overlooking the fence. The woman spotted them almost immediately once they stepped from the shadows. Her eyes widened the second she saw Ranger beside Daniel. "Oh my God," she whispered with visible relief as they approached the fence line from opposite sides. Ranger moved forward instantly, tail wagging harder now, while the woman crouched near the wire barrier. "Ranger," she breathed softly while reaching trembling fingers through the fence. The German shepherd pressed against her hand with complete trust. Daniel studied her carefully beneath the floodlights. She looked exhausted, nervous, and far too genuine to belong comfortably in a place like this. "You know him," Daniel said quietly. The woman nodded quickly. "I helped train him." Her voice lowered immediately afterward. "Listen to me carefully. Victor Hale has been searching for him nonstop since he escaped." Daniel frowned. "Escaped from what exactly?" The woman glanced nervously toward the compound buildings before answering. Ranger was part of a behavioral research program Hale runs for private security contracts. They train dogs for high-level surveillance and tracking work. Daniel looked down at Ranger beside him. That still does not explain why he ran. The woman's expression shifted painfully. Because Ranger was never aggressive enough for what Hale wanted. Daniel felt anger tighten inside him again. Meaning? She swallowed hard before continuing carefully. Hale only values obedience. Total control. But Ranger bonded too deeply with handlers. He protected people instead of simply following commands. Ranger remained pressed against the fence beside her hand while she spoke. A few weeks ago, Hale ordered Ranger transferred to another facility out of state. I knew once he left here, nobody would ever care what happened to him again. Daniel stared at her silently. So you helped him escape. Tears filled the woman's eyes immediately, though her voice stayed steady. I opened a transport gate during the storm outside Flagstaff. I thought maybe he could disappear before they found him. Ranger looked up at Daniel, then back toward the woman, as if connecting both worlds together in that single moment. The woman wiped quickly at her eyes before whispering urgently, "You need to leave tonight. Hale is planning to come after him personally tomorrow morning." Then suddenly bright headlights swept across the compound behind her, and voices echoed somewhere near the kennels. Daniel sat alone outside Earl's garage later that evening while the Arizona sky burned orange behind the mountains and cool desert wind drifted through the quiet town of Williams. Ranger rested beside his chair with his head across Daniel's boots, finally calm after days of tension and uncertainty. The old pickup truck was repaired now, parked near the garage doors beneath fading sunlight. But for the first time since arriving in town, Daniel no longer felt eager to leave. Too much had changed in only a few days. Across the parking lot, Earl locked the garage for the night before walking over carrying 2 cups of coffee like he always did. "You hear from your daughter again?" he asked softly while handing Daniel one of the cups. Daniel nodded slowly. "We talked for nearly 2 hours. Earl smiled faintly. "That good, huh?" Daniel stared out toward the highway where headlights rolled endlessly through the darkening desert. "I kept waiting for her to hang up," he admitted quietly. But she did not. Ranger lifted his head slightly at the sound of Daniel's voice before settling back down again. Earlier that afternoon, Emily had told him everything he never knew. After Rebecca passed away from illness 2 years earlier, Emily spent months angry at Daniel for disappearing emotionally long before the divorce had ever happened. But time had softened some of that pain. She admitted she missed him more than she wanted to admit. She even laughed once during the call, exactly like she used to when she was younger, and hearing that sound again had nearly broken Daniel apart right there beside Earl's garage. "She wants to visit next week," Daniel said quietly. Earl grinned. "Sounds like life finally decided to stop kicking you around." Daniel laughed softly under his breath. "Maybe." A pickup truck rolled slowly into the lot just then. Daniel tensed automatically until Claire stepped out wearing jeans and a gray jacket with her hair tied back against the evening wind. Ranger jumped to his feet immediately with his tail wagging hard enough to shake his whole body. Claire smiled the second she saw him. "Hey, Ranger." The German shepherd ran to her happily while Daniel watched with quiet relief. Claire looked far more relaxed now than she had near Hale's compound. "Authorities showed up at the property this morning," she explained while approaching them. Turns out Hale had a lot more hidden than just unethical training methods. Daniel nodded slowly. "The notebook helped." Claire gave a small, grateful smile. "More than you know." She crouched beside Ranger, scratching gently behind his ears while the dog leaned against her shoulder with complete trust. "He is safe now," she whispered softly to him. Daniel watched the scene quietly, realizing something important for the first time. Ranger had not only saved himself by escaping that storm outside Flagstaff. In some strange way, he had also saved Daniel. Before meeting the dog, Daniel had been drifting through life invisible and disconnected from everyone who once mattered to him. Now suddenly he had people calling again, a future waiting again, a reason to keep moving forward again. Claire looked up toward Daniel after a moment. "What are you going to do now?" Daniel leaned back in the chair while the last sunlight faded beyond the mountains. For years that question would have terrified him because he never had an answer anymore. But tonight felt different. He looked down at Ranger resting peacefully between them and smiled faintly. "First," he said quietly, "I am going to see my daughter." Earl raised his coffee cup approvingly beside him while headlights continued moving endlessly along the highway beyond town, carrying strangers through the dark Arizona night. But for the first time in a very long while, Daniel Mercer no longer felt like one of them.